and an easy way to organize them and talk about them. He did us a favor by putting them together this way, even though that's not what he meant to do. But he was thinking about the diversity of life and how to organize it. After Linnaeus, in 1800, another individual came in, Lamarck. And Lamarck did specifically think about evolutionary processes because he was interested in how species might change over time. Not very many scientists or scholars had asked about that or written about that. We've talked about some of the Muslim early scholars, but other than those people, there's not a lot of ideas floating around about species changing through time. So Lamarck's one of the first ones who wrote some ideas down. The idea that he came up with for how species change over time, he called the inheritance of acquired characteristics. And his theory stated that an individual, actually during their lifetime,
individuals develop new features during their life by striving towards some goal.
aspect of this that was striving towards some goal. So happening because an animal has some goal, an individual has some goal. And his specific example were giraffes. The giraffes will stretch their neck, reaching for food, and over the course of their lifetime, their neck will get a little bit longer, and then they have babies with necks that are a little bit longer, and then that baby stretches a little bit more, and its neck gets a little.
Okay, I gotta stop looking at my phone. Okay, so giraffe stretches neck, reaching for food.
A little bit longer, and then they have babies that have necks that are a little bit longer. So the acquired characteristic, the slightly longer neck, is being passed down to the offspring. So that's how Lamarck said that change could happen over time in a species. So he's describing evolution, evolutionary changes. He's just using a mechanism that we know is not real. And scientists have actually tested this hypothesis quite a bit. And one of the the studies that very clearly show that this is not supported is that scientists had a whole slew of mice in the lab and they cut off all the tails of all the mice. And then all the mice had babies and every single baby had a tail. And they cut off all of those tails. And then those mice had babies and the babies still had tails. Generation after generation after generation, cutting off the tail did not result in babies with no tails. So this is not supported by data, but this was the first time that you get somebody in this particular scientific lineage thinking, how can there be change within a species or variation even within a species? There were some other scientists who wrote some things that very much influenced how Darwin was thinking about evolutionary processes as well. And Lyell was one of them. Lyell was a geologist, so he was interested in the foundations of the earth and geological processes, but those geological processes informed how Darwin was thinking about change over time. Lyell was most responsible.
Okay, uniformitarianism. Nope, that's not what I want to do. There we go.
For the idea of uniformitarianism, that there are natural forces at work today that also explain past events.
The idea that natural forces at work today also explain past events. Explain past events. Okay.
That seems pretty simplistic in that form, but if you look at these two pictures, on the left is a picture of the Grand Canyon. It's a canyon that's extremely deep, and there's a river down at the bottom. And on the right, there's a little bitty creek maybe that has a little teeny stream with a little teeny valley associated. And so what Lyell was thinking through uniformitarianism is that geological processes like the process of erosion work the same way today as they did in the past. And they've always worked at the same rate. So if you think about a little teeny ditch forming from a little tiny creek, that the longer that creek flows and maybe some big rainstorms come and more water gets washed through that particular creek, the longer that creek flows, the more it's going to eat away at the inside of that valley or that ditch until it gets deeper and deeper and wider and wider. But it takes a really long time for that to happen. So if it takes a really long time for a small creek or ditch to get even a little bit deeper, how long did it take for the Grand Canyon to form? And following that idea, looking at the Grand Canyon and saying erosion is a slow process, and it must have worked on this particular canyon for a very, very long time, Lyell came up with a concept of deep time, that in fact the Earth is very, very old. Before this, there was the kind of accepted idea based on biblical reckonings that the Earth was only about 6,000 years old. But in order for these geological processes to be working at the same rate over time, and for the Grand Canyon to exist, the Earth has to be much, much, much older than that. And that actually gives time for hypotheses like Darwin's to work. So Darwin comes into this context where other scientists have talked about uniformitarianism, so that we know that the Earth is very old, this concept.
Okay, so I'm going to take my blue highlighter, or let's go pink because we're doing like a red, and I'm going to highlight some of the important things like uniformitarianism and deep time, as she's having highlighted there.
Of deep time, and other scientists were talking about evolution, and I just have up here kind of a highlight of white European guys from a certain time period. But as we know, there were other scientists from other cultures and other languages also talking about evolution over time. So Darwin was influenced by all of these ideas and kind of puts them together. And so Darwin himself has some history to him that's important for understanding why he eventually got to where he got. And it really starts with the fact that he was like a privileged rich dude, and he couldn't really figure out what he wanted to do. And he first was going to go be a doctor, and he didn't like blood, so he quit. And then he was going to be a priest, but he didn't like seminary school, so he quit. But he really just liked to kind of wander around in the backyard and do stuff and like look at nature. So he married his cousin at some point, who was a Wedgwood of Wedgwood, China. So basically, this is a rich guy marrying a rich lady. And when you were a rich guy marrying a rich lady in the early 1800s, you could go do stuff like what Darwin did, which was hop on a boat called the HMS Beagle and sail
HMS Beagle? That's crazy. Okay.
around the world with a friend of his. He was the naturalist on the HMS Beagle, which meant that every place they stopped on this map, he would get off and collect some of the animals and describe them and think about them. That wasn't the point of the tour, but that was what his job was, and he did it for fun. And one of the most famous places they stopped was the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. And Darwin collected on all of these islands, he collected finches. So he collected a different finch from each island. Actually, let me put it a different way. He collected a finch from each island, and he wrote down where they came from and which island they came from, and he brought them all home. And when he got back to England, he found an ornithologist friend of his, a friend who works on birds, and he was like, look, I got these birds from all these different islands. And the ornithologist said, well, that those birds are different. Each bird on each island is different, but they all look like they're closely related. Like they all look like they came from one finch or look a lot like one finch, but each island has a different bird that's taking advantage of the different resources on each island. So Darwin and this ornithologist started thinking about this together. And Darwin also had some other hobbies. He was a pigeon breeder. So fancy pigeons are a thing. And he knew that if he wanted his fancy pigeons to have big tails or little tails or be white or be gray, that he needed to pick parents that had the feature that he wanted. So see this big fluffy white tail up here? If he wanted to have a lot of baby pigeons with big fluffy white tails, he needed a mom and dad with big tails. Or he needed a mom and a dad with the biggest tail he could find, and they would have babies that had big tails, and then he'd pick more parents to have big tails, until eventually he would select parents that had babies that had big white tails. So he knew about selection of features, but he did it himself. So that wasn't naturally selected, that was him selecting things. So he had some initial ideas, some initial observations that he's thinking about. For one, individuals and populations differ from each other. And I know that that doesn't sound like this great big idea now, but at the time, and people like Linnaeus, they were just...
Okay. It's interesting that we're learning because so originally we learned that let's see, my notes got a little got watered. So we had Aljahiz from 7796 who wrote the Book of Animals, and then we have Tusi who proposed theory of evolution for species 600 years before Darwin. And then we have Ibn Khaldun from the 14th century who writes about how humans evolved from monkeys and apes. In 1377. That's crazy. And now we're like, just like, oh, this guy. Initial observations. Especially because isn't there like a guy who also, I think his name is like, I don't know, because he does, it's Book Chin, I think. Versus John, is that? Yeah, it's Book Chin. I wonder if we'll learn about him, but probably not because he's an anarchist. So we'll see. Anyway, 1. Individual and population differ from each other. Individuals and yep, I know it's intro to anthropology study time. I'm doing it right now, actually, a little early. And a population differ from each other. You ever sneeze in a mask and then it smells like sneeze? Yeah, that's what I'm feeling right now. Okay, let's get back
Just
to it.
interested in one example from each species. They didn't care if members of a population differed. They didn't care if some were taller than others. They just cared what one looked like. So this was a big deal for him to kind of, okay, individuals in a population differ.
These differences are heritable, passed from parent to offspring. Okay. Okay, and we're going to highlight heritable because she's got it highlighted. I actually have this is an eraser, I think. Removed by friction, it says. Which is actually really cool, but yeah. I was actually hoping it was like a double tip because I do have double tip highlighters as well, but that's okay. Oh, many information that I should be not looking at, but my cat sat on my boyfriend's lap while he was eating cereal and he dripped milk on her. What the hell? Okay, anyways, back to this.
He also knew that these differences are heritable, which means they're passed from parents to offspring. He knew this from his own work with pigeons, and he started to think about how that work and him selecting features that he wanted to see in offspring, that working in pigeons in his backyard, might also work somehow in nature. He also knew something from a statistician named Malthus that population growth outstrips resources, meaning that populations will continue to
Outstrips resources.
grow until resources limit them.
Okay, so populations will grow until resources limit them. Which is interesting if we think about humans, but
So basically, animals will eat everything, members of the population will eat everything until there's not enough left to eat, and then they start fighting for what's left to eat or competing for what's left to eat. And the funny thing about Darwin is he came up with all of these initial observations and he thought about them, and then he kind of stopped thinking about them for a little while. Until somebody else started thinking about them too. There was a scientist named
Okay, we're looking at another scientist, Alfred. I hope that I don't have to remember all of these different scientists for any exam, but we'll see. '13. Damn, he lived 90 years.
Alfred Russel Wallace, who was kind of the opposite of Darwin in every way. He was kind of this poor kid who didn't have any formal tutoring or schooling, and he managed to get himself basically to Southeast Asia, where again he was working on animals on various islands that were closely related. And he contacted Darwin in 1858. He wrote him a letter, and he said, "Hey, I've heard you've been thinking about some of these ideas, and I've been thinking about some."
Okay. Contacted Darwin in 1858.
Some ideas too. What do you think about my ideas? And Darwin said, well, if I don't publish, then I'm going to get scooped.
Damn. This just shows that, like, whenever someone's my grandfather, he, came up with the idea for inline skates. Around the same time, the inline skates got a patent. Like, he was literally about to get a patent and then found out that there was already a patent for the same idea. And so he was rejected. And so I think that's interesting because I'm like, well, people can have these same ideas, be from different places, different backgrounds, and have the same ideas. It's just about, getting all on the same page. And that, not that I'm saying every idea is not unique, but I don't know, I'm going somewhere with this.
And he published on the origin.
Okay. On the origin of species by means of natural selection.
Of species by means of natural selection in 1859. Now, I tell the story that way, but it's not quite like that. For one, he had written on the origin of species by means of natural selection, this book. It was totally done, and then he wasn't ready to publish it, and he put it in a little cupboard underneath his stairs in his house. And you can still go to his house today, and you can see the little cupboard where he shoved this book. It was like, I'm going to put it in here, I'm going to forget about it. And when Wallace contacted him, he wasn't upset necessarily. His friends told him, oh, you should publish too. But in fact, the two men became like really cool pen pals, and they wrote each other letters their whole lives.
Okay.
And Wallace's work was published the same time as Darwin's work. In fact, they were published together at a scientific conference. But because Darwin was senior and had already written the entire book, his was the one that got all the attention. So it was healthy competition, but it was also friendly competition, and they stayed friends their whole lives. When it was published, it immediately sold out, and they printed more, and they sold out again.
Darwin's inferences. Ugh. Okay. One, there will always be competition over resources. Most offspring will not survive to reproduce. Which is interesting because I think, like, obviously, like, we're taking anthropology, so we're thinking about humans. But there's also the biological anthropology, and I think that we're talking more about the biological anthropology at the moment and how that shapes humans. So we're getting there. But I think that that talks a lot about, like, just, I don't know, like in the 1800s, like people would have a shit ton of children and then not all of them would survive. So that makes sense that he would kind of have that influence as far as like in connection to humans. But I think that nowadays, even though America has like a terrible birth survival rate for a Western country, most people tend to live and have their children live. And then their children live old enough to reproduce or choose not to reproduce.
And this book, what it does is explain the inferences that Darwin made from those initial observances. One, there will always be competition over resources, but most offspring will not survive to reproduce. So I put this picture of tent worms, at least that's what they called them around here when I was a kid. But there used to be so many tent worms that when you walked to the bus, you couldn't help but step on them.
That's rough.
You don't see that many anymore. But the idea is the same, that often species have lots and lots of babies, and most of those offspring will not survive to adulthood to reproduce. That has to do with limitation of resources. He also inferred that some individuals, since individuals differ within a population, they vary within a population, that some individuals will have features that allow them to outcompete others for limited resources. So certain members of a population will be able to get those limited resources more easily. They'll be able to get the food.
Oh, I am not paying attention. This is your problem with picking up your phone. Individuals with features that allow them to outcompete others for limited resources will have more successful offspring. Okay. That makes sense.
Food more easily. Those will have babies who grow up to have more babies. Having successful offspring means your offspring grow up to have more offspring. One of the reasons offspring will grow up to...
Okay. 3 offspring will look like their parents. Let's spell right. Their parents. And the population will change their time to resemble the individuals that are best equipped. See, when she gives the lectures in person, I don't imagine that I'm going to probably be writing. I'll probably be typing, actually. But I don't imagine that I'll be typing everything she puts on the slides because she'll share the slides ahead of time. But I am like, well, this is taking me a long time to get through a 38-minute video. Like, it's taking me a lot longer than the 38 minutes.
Look,
like,
or to be able to outcompete others for resources or grow up to have more offspring, is that the offspring will look like their parents. They will also have whatever trait allowed them to outcompete others for resources. So some parents will have a trait that allows them to outcompete others for resources. They'll have babies who also have the trait, and then those babies will grow up to have more babies who also have the trait, who will grow up to have more babies who also have the trait. Members of the population who don't have that trait won't have successful offspring. They won't be able to outcompete others for resources, and neither will their babies. Eventually, what you have happen is that members of the population with the trait will basically live while those without the trait won't. And over time, your whole population will go from maybe 2 individuals with the big long beaks to maybe 10 individuals with the big long beaks, to 50% of the population with big long beaks, to 75% of the population with big long beaks. As generation after generation goes by, soon your whole population is going to look like that first individual that was best equipped for food. Given enough time, that population that has now changed over time, individuals have not changed, the whole population has changed. A new species might evolve. So this was.
See, I had to pause that because my writing just doesn't catch up with her speaking.
It's all about what Darwin was calling an adaptation, what Darwin's calling a mechanism.
Okay. Darwin's. And if I'm remembering correctly, Darwin's also like incredibly racist. So like, I mean, obviously of the time, but like, it's still bad in the time because like, not everybody. And also like, you could have just met her. I don't know. And not that I'm like a big book gen guy because I'm pretty sure that he has the same faults, but I don't know. I just feel like maybe there's better people we could study.
A mechanism for producing adaptation, and that mechanism is natural selection. He knew about selection that he did on his fancy pigeons, and this was his way of talking about selection that happens in nature. That an adaptation is an anatomical, physiological.
Adaptation. Anatomical. Physiological. Or response. And of course, because I'm running fast, like my handwriting's not the best, which makes it like take longer because one, my left hand hurts, and two, I'm like trying to write at least somewhat legible for myself because it's not just about reading it, it's about then like typing it up, writing it again, recording yourself reading your notes, that type of stuff, and then like listening back which is crazy. But like the type of shit I want to be on. Okay. Again, highlight adaptation.
Or behavioral response of organisms or populations to the environment. So in his backyard, he decided which pigeons got to breed and produce offspring. In nature, it's the adaptations that decide which individuals breed and have offspring and which ones grow up to be able to outcompete others for resources. So an adaptation allows individuals to outcompete others for resources, and the natural selection is what allows those individuals to grow up and have babies who have successful babies. And we can see examples of this happening in real time. So a famous description of this is the Kettlewell moth experiment, which is a natural experiment. This wasn't something that somebody set up, but what it was seeing how variation in a population changes through time under natural conditions. And in this particular example, the Kettlewell moths were a population or a species of moth that lives in England, and there's variation in this moth population. There's dark ones and there's light ones. And during certain periods of time, dark ones and light ones are better equipped to deal with the conditions. So in this particular example, it started out that the light-colored moths, you can see one here, were better adapted to sitting on lichens on trees. So they blended in better, the dark ones didn't, birds ate them. But what happened over the course of the lives of these moths is that a factory was built upstream and it started spewing crap out into the environment, and the lichens on the trees died. So all those light-colored moths could no longer blend in. Instead, the light-colored moths are like this. They're sitting out there, they're easy to see, birds start eating them faster and faster. So over time, the color of the moth that was best adapted was different. And at this point, we have these dark-colored moths that are blending in better. They live longer to reproduce more. And over time, the population of moths changes in
Okay, giving my hand a break to go like this. But let's get to stress those muscles and like do like some bigger exercise. I can also use some lotion. I do it a weird way because I hate putting lotion on my hands. Oh, that just got all out of my ring. Okay, come on. Wow. That's crazy. Okay, anyways. And I also need to text my partner to see if he'll pick me up at 11. Okay.
color. It's not that individuals are changing in color. It's that dark individuals are living longer and are having babies that are colored dark that grow up to have babies that are colored dark. So generation after generation, you go from more light colored individuals to more dark colored individuals. So we're seeing natural selection on the color of the individual, and the entire population is changing over time. So natural selection.
Okay. natural selection towards evolution. It's also worth wondering, like, because I know that, like, people are like, oh, the FAFO, or like, it's natural selection if you're dumb or whatever. But it's like, is that, I don't know, that's like a right-wing rhetoric. And so I'm wondering, like, how is that connected? And
selection is happening on individuals and the entire population is evolving. That's important. Adaptation is to current conditions only. So there's a little kind of saying, adapted today, gone tomorrow.
hyperspecialization danger. That's why, like, when I think about that, I think about, like, finding my niche. I'm like, is that dangerous to find a niche?
If you're hyper specializing, this is a danger. Woolly mammoths are a great example of this. They were hyper specialized to cold conditions. And when those cold conditions changed, there wasn't enough variation left in the population that some of them could survive the warmer. If some of them could have survived the warmer, those few would have survived to have successful offspring who would have survived to have successful offspring. There wasn't enough variation left because they were so hyper specialized to the cold. So eventually, woolly mammoths died off completely. To switch gears to a more kind of micro level, not selecting.
Okay, we have somatic cells and gametes. And I'm sure she's going to explain what those are, but I'm just going to Google definition, somatic cells. We have any cell of a living organism other than reproductive cells. Okay, and then gametes. Oh, I did not mean to translate that. See, okay. Okay. A reproductive cell of an animal or plant. All right, and then we're going to highlight somatic cells and gametes, just because if she's mentioning them in the video, then it's probably like
For individuals with variation so that entire populations evolve, let's zoom in a little bit to cells. You'll see where I'm going with this in just a minute. I'm going to remind you of the cell types in your body. You have somatic cells, which are your body cells, and you have gametes, which are sex cells. So somatic cells can be liver cells, nerve cells, muscle cells. Gametes, you're either producing ovum.
Okay. Okay, and then we have like liver cells, nerve cells, muscle cells. Okay.
And each one of these cells has a certain amount of your DNA. So your DNA is actually organized according to chromosomes, which are these nice.
And again, I know what a chromosome is, like, functionally, but let's just Google the definition. And of course, we're skipping past on Google all the AI stuff. Oh, I just got an email and it's nothing in it important. Carrying genetic information in the form of genes. Okay, and then again, we're going to highlight chromosome. Just because.
Nice little bundles, and they're coiled up DNA. So if you were to stretch out your DNA really long and uncoil it, it could go for feet. Like, it's so long, the amount of DNA that you have in each cell. So it's bundled up in these neat chromosomes, and humans have 46 chromosomes. So we say that we have 23 pairs of chromosomes, so 46 total.
Okay, that's written terribly.
And the structure of DNA for a long time wasn't fully understood. Scientists.
Oh, yeah, because DNA is short for deoxyribonucleic acid. There we go. That's how you pronounce that.
Just knew it was there. Darwin didn't. He didn't understand how heritability happened. He just knew that it did. But finally, it was discovered that the structure of DNA is a double helix. So this is deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA. And Watson and Crick are the two scientists who were given credit for discovering this particular double helix structure. I would be remiss not to point out that it was Rosalind Franklin who, in fact, took the pictures of the DNA that allowed them Rosalind Franklin structure. Given credit acid, DNA, and Watson and Crick are the two scientists who were given credit for discovering this particular double helix.
No.
Particular double helix structure. I would be remiss not to point out that it was Rosalind Franklin who, in fact, took the pictures of the DNA that allowed them to describe the structure of it and win the Nobel Peace Prize. And she did not win the Peace Prize because she died of radiation poisoning before it could happen. So this is the famous picture that she took that led to the discovery of how it's structured. And of course, when we talk about DNA, there's several analogies that you can use, and sometimes I switch between a ladder and a zipper. But this double helix means that there are two backbones. So that's even a third analogy. So here's one backbone, and here's another backbone. And each side of the helix is made up of nucleotides. So a nucleotide has three.
Okay. And now we're back to Googling nucleotide. Let's spell that right. Okay. A compound consisting of nucleoside. Okay. I hate when it says stuff like that where it's like, the definition of this is like the plural version of this or something like that. I hate this chair. Okay. So, compound consisting of nucleoside linked to a phosphate group. Forms the basic structural unit Okay, cool. Okay.
Three parts to it, a sugar and a phosphate. So here's the sugar and here's the phosphate that make up.
Oh, and then I can highlight nucleotide because, oh, let's do that better. And then we're also going to do DNA equals deoxyribonucleic acid because I feel like that's going to be like a, what does DNA stand for? And then it's going to be like, fuck. I don't remember that.
The backbone, and then a base. So here's the base right here.
Okay, I'm definitely gonna have to, let's see. Let's turn off the captions and we're gonna take a picture of this or screenshot. So that way I can, let's see. Can I rename it? No. Okay, that's fine. I'll find it later. Okay. Cool.
So each nucleotide has a sugar and a phosphate to make up the backbone and a base. And these bases go together in a very specific way to make a base pair. So they can only bond with certain other bases. You always see G's and C's together. You always see A's and T's together. What's amazing about DNA, in every living organism on our planet only has these 4 bases. The DNA of every single living organism is structured the same way, which is why we can say we have so much similarity with other genomes. And every single cell in your body houses DNA in it. Your body.
Okay. So we have proteins, hemoglobin, oxygen transport, collagen, connective tissue. I feel like I don't have enough of that. Adrenaline, like your adrenal glands, metabolism. Maybe I just need to start fight or flighting myself to get my metabolism going. Okay. And muscles. And we're going to highlight each of those keywords here as proteins. And I'm going to do a brief check of whatever this thing came up on Reddit. That's crazy. Okay. Wild. Okay.
Body cells house the full 46 chromosome complement. Your sex cells only house 23 chromosomes because you only have half the number of chromosomes in your sex cells because you only want to give your offspring half of their DNA. And every single cell has all the information, but every single cell also only uses the information that they need. So the main purpose, the way we're thinking of it, for the DNA is housing the information or storing the information that's needed to create proteins. So every cell creates the proteins that it needs in order to function, in order for your entire body to function. So hemoglobin, for instance, is one protein, collagen is another protein, and depending on what classes you guys are in, you're learning some more detail about some of these. But this is the detail that we need to know. And so how do we get from the string of bases that you have on your double helix to the information that's needed to build proteins? Well, this is just half of a double helix. So this is one half of a DNA strand. You can see this sequence of 4 different bases. And what your body does is use this sequence to build the
Okay, just 10 minutes left in this lecture, and then we're taking a break.
the protein, which is a chain of amino acid building blocks. So we need to know what order to put amino acids in. And we can read these different bases in sequences of 3. So 3 bases is called a codon, and that codon codes for a specific amino acid. So every 3 bases is a codon that codes for a specific amino acid. So when you read a strand of DNA, you're reading a sequence of codons, which then translates into a sequence of amino acids that when you put them together is a functioning protein, or at least part of a functioning protein.
I'm just writing a note to myself to review the DNA stuff with the group, because I'm meeting up with the group to do anthropology work tomorrow, and hopefully that will all make sense. So, mutation. Any error that occurs in the process. Any error that occurs in the process of copying DNA that can be transmitted to daughter cells. Now, what the hell are daughter cells? Okay. I'm going to highlight the review DNA stuff with the group so that I remember. Highlight that mutation thing, and then we're going to Google daughter cells, because she might go over that in a sec, but the daughter cell definition is the cells that are formed after cell division. Okay, let's just write that. So we have it, because my worry is just that, like, she's saying a lot of stuff in the lecture, and that's like a base of knowledge, and that when we get to the exam, if I don't have that base of knowledge for some of the basic things, because I didn't take a biology class this semester or recently, then it could be a little foggy. Daughter cell. Cells that are formed after cell division. Okay, and then we're going to hide daughter cells. Okay, back to the menu.
We want to go with this. Where are we going with these details? Well, a mutation is any error that occurs in the process of copying DNA that can be transmitted to daughter cells. So remember, we're reading the DNA to form proteins, and a mutation is an error in copying that sequence of DNA bases. And a mutation can be pretty significant depending on where it happens. A point mutation is a type of mutation that's just a mistake in one base. So when we
Point mutation. One mistake. Let's go back a sec.
Mutation that's just a mistake in one base.
Okay.
So when we look at this particular sequence of bases, the T's, the G's, and the A's, and the C's, that's a particular sequence of bases. That sequence codes for the amino acid chain that is part of a normal beta hemoglobin protein. So beta hemoglobin is the protein that is responsible for moving oxygen throughout your bloodstream. And this is the sequence that you need to create for your cells to create a normal beta hemoglobin protein. This sequence here, there's one mistake. So there's 1 point mutation that instead of a T, there's an A. And you might think, that's just one base in a strand of potentially hundreds of bases in a chromosome that maybe has millions of bases. What is 1 point mutation going to do? Well, in this example, what that 1 point mutation does is change the amino acid that is put in line or is added to the line or to the sequence because it changes the codon. So instead of CTC that codes for glutamic acid, what you have is CAC that codes for valine. Now again, you might say, well, there's a whole sequence of amino acids that makes this protein. Is that one amino acid that important? And in this case, for this sequence, it is, because hemoglobin can still be produced using this sequence, but it's not normal beta hemoglobin, it's sickle cell beta hemoglobin. And so in this case, these blood cells are sickle-shaped, have less capability of carrying the oxygen through the blood and can cause a lot of pain and sometimes even harm for the individuals with sickle cell. So sickle cell.
Let's look at sickle cell. Red blood cells are misshaped. Typically crescent or sickle shaped. Gene mutation that affects the hemoglobin molecule. Okay, cool. Got that done. And then we're going to just highlight.
Anemia is something that we see in lots of members of our population, and it's the result of 1 point mutation. So right there, I want you to be thinking, oh, wow, one change, one mistake can lead to variation in a population. It's important when these mutations take place.
Okay, we've got mitosis. Remembering correctly, that's just them splitting, but yeah, body cell division into 2 identical daughter cells, that makes sense. Okay, now I wonder, because it says body cell, that means that the mitosis, does that mean that mitosis doesn't occur in sex cells? Let's Google. Does mitosis happen in sex cells? Okay, mitosis occurs in somatic cells. Okay, so not involved in the production of gametes. Cool.
If a mutation takes place during mitosis, that's cell division that leads to body cells. So body cell division, when one single cell divides to two identical daughter cells, that's when your own body is creating new cells. So bone cells, skin cells, things that just cells that are letting your body run. Meiosis, on the other hand, is cell division.
Oh, that would make sense. There's one for sex cells or gametes. Meiosis. You can tell I didn't like biology class, but you know. Leads to the formation of gametes. And now it does have the sperm and ova in parentheses, but I've already written that down and to save myself time, even though I'm talking about it, I'm just like, I'm going to remember that gametes is sex cells and that they're the sperm and the ova. And in fact, I've got it written down under gametes, ovum or sperm.
Division that leads to the formation of gametes, or sperm and ova. This is the cell division that your body is going through or creating for sperm and egg that are going to be passed down to the next generation. When your mutations occur, if it's during mitosis or meiosis, it makes a difference. Mitosis, just the small representation here on the left. Meiosis, the small representation here on the right. And as you guys know, this is actually much more complicated than this. I just want you to consider what happens when a mutation occurs during each one of these processes. Because it can occur during both. And if a mutation occurs during mitosis, which is body cells, these are called
Okay, mutation can occur during both mitosis and meiosis. I'm just going to put in both. I'll put an arrow. Okay. So, somatic mutations not inherited.
somatic mutations, and they're not inherited. They just affect you. They affect you during your life. Somatic cells do lead to cancer and other types of issues. And here is actually an old image, and every single one of these, this is an old image of a map of chromosomes. And so you can see the 23 pairs on here. And each one of those red markers is a place where cancer can occur because of a particular somatic mutation, but that cancer is just going to affect you. Now, I don't want you to get too bent out of shape about this particular figure. The chances that mutations happen at those loci or those addresses on your chromosome are very, very low. But if they do, those mutations are just going to affect you. A mutation during meiosis, on the other hand, this is where things get interesting, because these mutations are inherited. So they're passed on to the next generation. So if cells are dividing and a mistake is made, like the mutation that leads to sickle cell anemia, that mutation, if it happens during meiosis, is going to be passed down to your offspring. Mutations can
Okay, highlighting chromosome errors.
Also happen on bigger scales. So point mutations just happen for individual bases, but chromosome errors can occur too. So this is when failures of chromosomes to separate completely during cell division. So it's not just one base that's wrong, it's the entire pair doesn't divide correctly. So if you see on the left, what we have is a situation where you have a map of the 23 pairs. And so here's the 22, what we call autosomes, which code for all the boring stuff like hair color and height, and then your sex chromosomes here. And most individuals have 2 sex chromosomes because it's a pair of sex chromosomes. So a monosomy is when you only have 1 chromosome in a pair. So mono means 1. And in this case, this is Turner syndrome. So this individual only has 1 sex chromosome, and that's an X chromosome. On the right over here, again, you can see the 22 pairs of autosomes, and then you can see the sex chromosomes here. So there's a pair of the sex chromosomes. What you might notice, though, is there's actually 3 chromosomes.
Trisomy. Patau syndrome.
Chromosomes here instead of 2. That's called a trisomy, so 3 chromosomes. And this particular example is at chromosome pair 13. So this is trisomy 13. And this is called Patau syndrome. And so in these cases, sometimes having not enough chromosomes or not having the normal amount of chromosomes or having too many chromosomes, that is fine. And individuals might just have certain manifestations of that through their lives. And sometimes it's not consistent with life. So these can be much bigger effects and have much bigger effects on offspring. Now, some effects of mutations can go from quote-unquote bad to quote-unquote good. So some of the quote-unquote bad ones are having zygotes that are just non-viable, a protein's completely not functional, or has a reduced function. And sometimes these mutations can be good, where maybe the protein has a completely new function or an improved function. But the vast majority of mutations are completely neutral. They have no effect at all. The point of all of this, though, is to show you that we understand just from the basic structure of DNA that errors in the copying of those bases, or even in the copying of the entire chromosomes, lead to changes in protein functions. Almost all of them lead to nothing, but some of them can lead to changes in protein functions. And those changes are where variation in a population comes from. And variation in a population is what allows some individuals to outcompete others for resources, which allows natural selection to happen, and then over time, evolution of a population.
Project 2025, the conservative leader.
Okay, well, that went straight into something else. Protein has improved function. Okay, good. Cool. That level of notes is done, and so I'm going to stop sharing. And that took me an hour and 20 minutes to get through. Obviously, I was pausing, taking a little bit of breaks, but that we were about sometime in, and we did, let's see how many notes. We did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of notes for about 20, 25-ish things, and minutes, and that sounds about right. So I will meet you guys later when I'm back in my office, hopefully with a better setup, and we'll do some live streaming there. Thanks, and hopefully I'll see you soon.